Добрый день. Позвольте поприветствовать всех.
Good morning. Welcome everybody to our forum. We continue. Our session is changes in consumer behavior following the pandemic. Let's specify who are our guests today. Let's introduce Raisa Polyakova, Chief Executive Officer, KFC in Russia and CIS, and Sergey Belyakov, Managing Director of Ozon. Thank you very much that you found time to join us today. The question which we are going to discuss might sound trivial or simple in some sense, but you know, one of the most important results of the previous year was that this was the year of breaking down the classical economists' views. The diagnosis was set very early. The behavior change in its structure that was obvious. People started to consume less services, and the services were different, demand was different, and the non-production segment grew. And in 2021, we got inflation growth as a consequence, and practically the forecasts are now changing. It is very difficult to make forecasts in the changing environment. The consumer, the basic messages didn't work as well. Please correct me when I'm wrong. The consumer first consumes less services, becomes more digital, goes online, changed its behavior in terms of visiting shopping malls and spending free time from this point of view. What are the consequences? Economists may have mistaken, and the business was more pragmatic. Business passed 2021 quite good. And let us discuss two main aspects. First, changes in consumer behavior, and second, changes in the business in return to and in reaction to these changes in the economic and consumer behavior. Sergey, I'd like to address to you, I break this gender principle. We are for balances. There's no breaking. It's 2022 already. We have to discuss the following question, if you may. Now, online behavior, online consumption, you represent online. It's online platform Ozon. It's 25% of all total spend of households. Approximately the same share it made at the peak of pandemic in April, May 2020. The estimates could differ, but we are approximately at the same level we were in April, May 2020. Well, probably the golden era of online is already over. Is behind us. So we already got maximum what we could get from these technical and economic changes. I would avoid such formulations as a golden era. And I explain why I think we didn't pass the peak and the development of the consumer behavior. This trend was built well before the pandemic. The pandemic just accelerated this trend and made up the behavior as a must because there were significant limitations in offline formats and citizens were sitting in lockdowns in April and May and partially June 2020, and it inevitably made people make online purchases, use e-commerce already for those who didn't have this habit. But the habit was there, and before the session we discussed how Russia was ahead of many other countries, how Russia outpaces in terms of the usability of online services, applications and smartphones and gadgets, and internet penetration is really strong, and it is not expensive. It builds a fast adaptation for changing conditions. What was a need 1.5 years ago, now it's a good habit. People don't want to get rid of it. This is a very important moment. I think this trend would continue. There could be different trends. I wouldn't guess, but since all companies of online trade and companies providing services online caught it and used it very fast. They know how to improve the quantities, increase the quantity of services and consumers. We will see the faster growing of this segment. It doesn't mean that offline would die. God beware, we should not do this. It should be all organic. The second important thing, those figures, 12 to 14%, which you mentioned, I remember that e-commerce share in the world, in the Asian segment of the global economy and Northern American economy, is much higher than in Russia. And it shows those borders to which we are going to move, and it's not the limit. This share will grow as well there. So the golden era, I don't know about the golden era, but I know that this is an unstoppable trend. I do know it. This segment is growing in a number of multitude from year to year. I would agree with Sergey. First, digitalization, e-com penetration, that all starts before the pandemic. It's obviously that the pandemic gave the new impetus to this, and the development went much faster. If we speak about the food market, we do see that there are markets where the share of digital sales could reach up to 50% in restaurant business in Arabic countries. It's 40-45% are e-com sales there. And it will all be developing quite fast. What else we see? For the recent 2 years, we had two peaks with lockdown, where the delivery volumes grew drastically and e-com sales grew, especially in restaurants. When lockdown finished, the figures didn't come back to the previous levels, but they were fixed at higher levels. And if we look now on figures, if it was 3 to 5% before pandemic, and during pandemic it reached up to 20 during lockdown, it didn't bounce back to 5. Now, if we have a look at the market of food, restaurant, it's 10 or a little bit higher. A very interesting aspect, Raisa, about food and restaurants. The consensus is the following. Roughly speaking, a consumer is still using restaurant, fast food, and cafes services. But if previously they used the volume, the space to, now they use more delivery services. To what extent you could say that this is fixed? Will it stay like that? Or will it bounce back? Yes, the delivery services will be of demand, a higher demand. It wouldn't mean that traditional restaurants would go. The share of people who are willing to spend time in restaurants is very high, because people go there not only for food, but also for contact, for relations, for the atmosphere, to have an opportunity to go out. But the delivery is really convenient, it's comfortable. And what else I wanted to note, another interesting segment which is growing apart from delivery, we call it click and collect. So you can order it in the application and pick it up at the time it's convenient. So this segment grew from the scratch. It needed time for applications, for development. It's not from scratch. Now, from the scratch, it reaches up to 10%. This is absolutely new channel, which, as we see, what else is interesting? It doesn't cannibalize. Click and collect and delivery, we believe, incremental sales. It means there is some part of cannibalization, but this is rather another way, another channel which is good for the industry in general. As a result of what we discussed one by one, can I ask you to tell me the milestones in terms of market share and business structure towards we're going in e-com of 12 or 14%? Does Ozon have a strategic vision? What figures you embed probably in general? Could you tell me in general what piece of the consumers you think will go to e-com? I think we should reach quite fast the e-com share of 20% in the sales structure across the country. I may be mistaken. I probably may not be very precise in percentage or in the years, but the fact that this will be reached soon, that's the fact. And sorry for going out of my scope of responsibility, speaking about food and food delivery and e-commerce as a delivery service for food products. I think it would be right to cite an example which would explain it very well. It's not the issue of competing delivery against the traditional form of consumption in the restaurant. It's the need to purchase product, to process product. It's another element of competition. It doesn't mean just to compare, are we going to a restaurant or take your food home. This is in general the consumer model of the behavior. Do you need to spend time for cooking food, or you should buy everything? Or you can just order it ready-made and take into account the delivery time for such fresh categories, which is food, of course, is drastically changing as soon as one company pops up in the market which is able to deliver it not in an hour but in 30 minutes and then in 20 minutes. It sets the golden standards which would be a model for other businesses. And all other businesses should follow its suit. And then the consumer finds a few proposals which are very good and with high quality. So the demand for this model is there. It is growing. It's a different economics which allows to spend less money, and the ability to save time and money and to get high quality service, on my opinion, dictates the fact that 20% is a reasonable threshold, and then we can go even further. Stores also started to develop, and all leaders in the market started to develop online deliveries. Those who didn't do it before, they either they went or they tried to have very radical forms of competition. Yes, the same estimate, about 15 to 20%. It will grow and will be growing. It is related to the lifestyle changes and the fact how our guests see how they willing to spend their time. And the question is, who competes against each other? Competition starts to move away, move beyond the borders and of traditional industries. If you want to deliver, you should compete against aggregators. On one hand, they can be your providers who would help you to deliver your goods, but on the other hand, your own brand, you can develop your own channel. And this is a continuous discussion in this field. Well, when you, as a traditional food industry, have to sit in all that, in this environment, you are not only dealing with food, you building up big digital ecosystems using which you can do your business. These facets of competition are becoming quite vague and fuzzy. When we are looking at our product, at our chicken, well, we can deliver it through our own channel, but there's a number of partners with whom we can work, with whom cooperate. We do cooperate with them. We cooperate not only with aggregators, because the discussion is around marketplaces, selling food at marketplaces. It's the same. Ozon, as an example, this area is now under consideration. And the question should be put, what will be the limiting factor for the development of e-com? And we continuously should take into account the last mile. Who is going to deliver it to the end customer? And at some point of time, we should go deeper in the situation in this market, in the market of delivery, because this will be, in the end, be our limiting factor. How will we be able to develop it physically?
Я правильно понимаю, что вы хотели бы об этом?
Did I get you right that you would like to develop this topic? Yes, why not? But still we see there is a very special attitude to the offline business model, because in any case we will not have enough couriers to drive everything online. But considering the delivery options, the changes in the consumer behavior, that's right. Now, what do you do with the hubs? Are your restaurants just like hubs from which it is more convenient to deliver food, or do you use them as restaurants? Of course, restaurants can be different size, different level, different format, depends on the size of the city, the scope of traffic, and so on. But the majority of revenue still comes from offline service. People come and consume. But our business started as a traditional brick and mortar business. It was a building to which people came to consume. Brand building for us was not just about communication of our brand concept to the guests. It's also about penetration and recognizability. You know, you have a KFC everywhere you go. So the fact that your brand is well known, it's very much linked to the penetration. And that's why the number of restaurants we have around, they build up the brand recognizability. Okay, you can have a small area, you can put a big sign, and people will know you. Yes, but KFC is a brand which has specific production processes. We receive the cold chicken and we prepare it, we cook it ourselves in our restaurants. So it's not about 6 square meters and a big sign. No, that's more than that. And still, the questions are about the kitchen, for instance. Where do we need to have a kitchen? Do we have to have only one brand or combine? Then you have to choose the right location for your restaurants, and the location should be chosen based on the scientific principles of choosing the place where other couriers cannot deliver cooked food, where where other restaurants do not cover the area. I represent KFC, but there are other brands and other options. And this discussion is underway somewhere, yes, and even startups are being opened in this context. There are interesting trends. For instance, companies that worked in aggregation business in the past, which are now approaching big brands, suggesting to build these multi-brand dark kitchens, so to say. Okay, let's give the floor to Sergey as well. What about the offline business? Tatiana Bakalchuk, she suggested some time ago to close offline stores for periods of crisis, of pandemic, and so on. Okay, let's not bring up the epidemiological aspect of this, but do you envisage such an option at all? I have a different opinion of this. I founded an industry association of chain stores, and when I hear someone suggesting to close offline stores, I consider these suggestions as dangerous. But because that's wrong to develop one's business due to at the expense of closing someone else's. And we are talking not about separate businesses, but the industry as such, because e-commerce is still first commerce and then electronic commerce. We sell goods. The question is how we place goods, how many SKUs, how we market them, but still it's about retail. And how can we decide for the consumers what is better for them, what is worse? That's wrong. The market participants' philosophy should be different. It's up to fair competition to decide what and who will survive and what will not. But we should not decide for the consumers, and instead of consumers, what they like and what they dislike, because tomorrow maybe someone will come and will say, and let's abolish e-commerce. I very much respect what traditional food and non-food chain stores do. In our country, the retail function was underestimated very much, and the state did not really appreciate the true role of the food retail. That's why it took us a long time to negotiate with the federal government, with the Ministry of Economic Development, with Rospotrebnadzor. We are very grateful to them that the limitations due to the pandemic were not catastrophic to the industry. That's why I fully disagree with any suggestions to close down some business or type of business in order to help others. No, I fully agree. I fully agree. Let's not forget that a large number of offline stores, restaurants, whatever, is also the jobs of many people, and this is a social project as well, and no one will be able to close down an industry and these jobs. Okay, let's come back to the infrastructural aspects. The marketplaces like Ozon, Wildberries, Yandex Market, SberMega Market, and others. This is called the new digital infrastructure already, because we have traditional infrastructure and digital infrastructure. So this is not just roads and bridges. This is something different. Based on what we just discussed, based on the prospects of consumption trends, I know you've been investing in infrastructure. And let me rephrase the first question from a different point of view. From the point of view of investment and company development, how much more will we have to invest? Are we far away from the natural limitations? I will not quote any figures, it's not in my competency, but of course we are trying to invest on purpose. We invest in creating the infrastructure, and we are not the only ones doing so, because availability and accessibility of our service for our customers is what matters. And infrastructure, both logistics, warehousing, transportation infrastructure is of utmost importance. Those of us who will underestimate the importance of these investments will not win the game. And talking about investments in the IT, these investments will be always there, because the IT channels change, the preferences of the guests change. People want this or that, so you will always have to invest, and a lot of money always, in the IT. When we started this business, we thought that there is an ideal level of IT development when you invest, and then you don't have to. But now we realized that investments in IT will never stop. So now we have both ourselves and Ozon, for instance. They have huge IT and digital teams. We compete with each other. We compete with other major players in this market, in this industry. You spoke about the competition, which is not characteristics in this new reality. And now, look at the labor market. Those who in the past seemed not to compete, today they do compete for the workforce. Did you face the limitation in terms of the lack of couriers, the lack of workforce, or do you think it may become a problem shortly? I wouldn't say that we have limitations, but there are certain barriers to further growth. It's penetration. We are brand number one in the Russian market in terms of the outlets. And the more restaurants you open, the more you have to change the business model. You have less profit, you go to different regions, to remote regions, smaller formats, and the business model is different. But we do have a plan of how to approach this rollout. And if there were no limitations in the market, if there were more couriers available, for instance, so we would be able to further develop the delivery opportunities. But aggregators, they are at different levels of evolution. Someone is yet aggressively investing. Someone has already gone past this stage, and he's very cautious about your offers. But we see that aggregators and courier companies are ready to cover major cities. Of course, Moscow and St. Petersburg are the top cities in this respect. But when you talk about small towns, of course, our partners and big aggregators, they have less desire to go, because there you have to hire people, you have to build the business models and so on. And this is the limiting factor. Even though people living there, they are mentally ready for this to happen, and they don't want to wait for 2 weeks to receive their delivery. They want everything to be delivered in no time, like we have it here in the main cities. Okay, without discussing the infrastructure, warehousing, and logistics, what about your restaurant business? You have your own delivery service, and you have some outsourced delivery service, right? Talking about delivery, first of all, we are talking about our own channel of delivery. We have to understand via which interface our guest, our visitor, places an order. And then it's about the information and how we use it further. So the channel is of interest to us because we have information about the guest, about what he wants, what services and products. And talking about the courier delivery, it all depends on the territory. There are countries, I know, where there are franchisees who operate restaurants, and they have their own courier services. And there are others who always outsource courier delivery, because courier delivery is a business, and if you do it, you have to do it really right. And this is not easy. Okay, talking about the restaurant business, let's take the fast food segment, restaurants. Consumers are changing very much. Someone says because of the pandemic, but they do change all the time. But still, I think that consumption is the same in terms of appreciating good quality. And in any case, this value is shaped year by year mentally. Of course, if you communicate with the elderly, they have different perception, but for the young, this is everything. And very often we hear critical opinions of fast food, even though I love it. Yeah?
Yes, train sustainability, they are quite pronounced. They become pronounced during pandemic. And young guests, expect from us that we as a company be sustainable. People want to get food with the good mood or with the flavor of good sense and good attitude, if you may. But this is a multifaceted quality. These are not only the quality of food, but also other things which are around it. The discussion about consumption of meat and CO2 emission and popularity of ingredients which do not pollute the atmosphere. We really try. We try the different tastes. The taste is really interesting of this artificial food, and this artificial meat is already present. The share is small, but the fact that it is already on the menu is the confirmation of that the company is sustainably growing and working on that. It's a building of green technologies, water recycling, separate garbage collection. That's all is there in this program. Probably it's not so obvious, but following the question about the infrastructure, since this trend is inevitable for this business in Russia, is our market of suppliers ready? Yes, you will be surprised, but at least we have one supplier of artificial meat who produces it and with good quality. And since we are an international company, we're able to work with everybody. But it is very good to see that you have a local producer, domestic market, in the domestic market. The same goes to the recyclable packaging, equipment, and other services which could add sustainability. Coming back to the topic of our discussion, how the consumer behavior changed in the food and the restaurant industry, how the attitude changed towards food and the attitude, the easiness of these things. In food, the people try to get good food. In terms of service, people seek for comfort and cheap. Sergey, does this sustainability trend concern you? Yes, it concerns us, and this is the part of our corporate strategy that belongs to the requirements of investors and the market, and this is part of the culture which is already existing. This is the fact. This is not just future, but this fact should not run counter to the demand of consumers for convenience. It relates packaging, it relates the ingredients and delivery. But these are all doable tasks, as practice shows. And the third factor is the legislation, which is changing towards stricter requirements how companies work in this area, what kind of materials they use, whether they're recyclable, what is the level of pollution. This is the international and national legislation of the European Union. We're not just somewhere in the outskirts. We are in this process. This is one of the in our company, we have a special department which is responsible for this area, and it's not just for the formal case. This demand, is this demand a parallel process or dependent on pandemic? No, the pandemic, as we discussed in e-commerce, the pandemic just accelerated some tracks which appeared before. I don't think it is strictly related. Although, however, many things are evaluated by us as a bystander from the outside. But if we can think, how can we personally influence it? We are small, but we are a lot of people, almost 8 billion population in the world. Then the picture would look different. When in Europe a lockdown was imposed earlier than in Russia, it was in March and the first part of April of 2020. You remember in Venus, channels become clearer, water became clearer, and people didn't remember when it was really clear. The system can clear up itself quite quickly when there are when negative processes disappear or stopped. When we see it, we can understand that it can be done and it should be done. It's very easy to explain why it's not possible, but when you understand the effects, the results, the picture would change. You get a little bit higher motivation. Raisa, do you agree? Yes, I absolutely agree. But these are connected, but not directly connected things, right? Yes, you're right. We all started it earlier, years before the pandemic, but we see how it speeded up our processes and what we do as an organization, and we see the changing requests from guests and from our employees towards sustainability. We get more and more questions, what the organization is doing, and the more and more desire to be part of those projects. For example, we quite very strong in volunteering. And we traditionally had a lot of areas, and in the recent 2 years we strengthened the environmental area, environmental stream. We got a lot of those who are willing to change in their demands. A small comment, if you may. The strongest limitation here is low income of population and poor population. The poor people, they get more demand for cheap products, cheap materials, and it also cheapens the service and prime cost. The quality, the higher quality, and the demand for higher quality is a very important task to improve the living standards and improve the welfare of the population. Yes, we discussed it already when we discussed plastic food. Plastic dishes. Okay, we have 2 more questions. Let's speak about problems. E-com thinks that it got some benefit from acceleration of digitalization and from pandemic things. Are there any obvious problems which appeared as a result of this trend of different sort from one to another, and probably excluding those infrastructural problems which we discussed? I would answer, business knows how to master all those problems. The most important problem, which could be the most important one, is the shrinking the politics of the state to the industry, when the industry is being associated with larger players. And in this case, when policy would mean building up artificial preferences, building up non-organic national champions, it would be equal to killing all others. The e-commerce effect, which you mentioned, the positive impact, is that there's a very high competition in a low concentrated market. We have a lot of players, which differs us even versus Asian and also European and North American market. And this is the basis for development of the whole segment, for the high quality of services for consumers who will then be able to choose But this risk that you mentioned relates not only to e-commerce regulation, it relates, unfortunately, for the whole current economic policy. In each industry, we have leaders. Raisa, I would rephrase a little bit the question for you. I work in Sber now, and German Graf told that the banks are walking dead and they will soon disappear. Traditional banking will disappear, and we will be evidencing it very soon. About the restaurants, we could have the same hypothesis. What do you think? How can you answer to this hypothesis? Well, we do not place the question like that. There will always be people who will be hungry, right? That's first. And more and more people will not be willing to spend time for cooking, despite the fact that during pandemic there were a lot of cooking courses, people bought a lot of equipment, but nevertheless it's just hobby. No one wants to spend the productive time for cooking food, for dealing with it on a daily basis. If we compare the levels, we calculate out-of-home market. The out-of-home market in Russia is very small, it's tiny, and we see the prospects. We have a lot of families who still cook and eat home, and it is because traditions and because of low incomes probably, and probably the availability of restaurants and good restaurants around if you go away from big cities, for example. This market is very prospective. It has a lot of opportunities for growth, and out-of-home market will be growing, and people will still come to restaurants. The classical business model of the restaurant, will it change? It will change, of course. The question that we are putting now, what kind of restaurants shall we build now? Big, small, what shall we, the equipment there, what kind of products shall we use there? Even if we look at the evolution of our restaurants, we can study it. We took a model now, one small place, 100 square meters, and you can place it in between two big restaurants to bridge the gap, or you can use it in a very small village or settlement. We have the full strategic stream like that. It's a smart box. It's called smart box. Small restaurants, you place it in a small village, 20,000 people population. For example, Shakhovskaya village, 90 kilometers away from Moscow, Volokholamskaya highway, and it works perfectly. And the question is, how can we consider this restaurant? Is it, well, if you look at it as, I don't know, as a restaurant in Kaluga, it's at the entrance of the city. Across the road, there's a dwelling complex, and people come who live there. They come to work, and people come there to eat, to charge their phones, to listen to music. Workers from the plant come there to check whether their products are properly used and what is the quality. This is just a center of gravity for the whole small district. The physical restaurant will exist, will still be existing. We have only 1 minute per each question. Let's please, could you just draw the conclusion, make my life easier? Draw conclusion, summing up what we discussed in terms of consumer behavior. The model changed. The model changed not because the pandemic just accelerated these changes. And these changes doesn't mean that previous formats of delivery would die. No, they are still significant, and this is a good condition to develop both offline and online, because this is a good competition, it's a healthy competition. The question whether we should be in e-commerce or not does not exist. You're either there or you're lost. The penetration issue in the business. The penetration happens not only due to physical points of sale, but in omni-channel way. You penetrate not only due to construction, but also entering other channels. And the question whether the guest is afraid, no. He is demanding for that. He's ready to go without the human over the counter, but this experience should be easy, comfortable, and the e-com task not just to organize the transaction, to make it good for the person and willing to come. This is another very big topic of discussion, competition of UX and UI, and indeed, very often they just opt for the application where it's easier and faster, and not because of it's better. Everything else is equal. Thank you very much for this discussion. I would like to remind you we had Raisa Polyakova, Chief Executive Officer KFC, and Sergey Belyakov, Managing Director of Ozon. Thank you very much for your time. I hope that your standpoints are quite clear, and we now have more clarity what kind of consumer we will have to deal with in future. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
До свидания.